Good morning. I am Dr. Wanda Brown, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution and Director of the Brookings Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors. Welcome to today's event on Non-State Armed Actors and the US Fragility Strategy. We have an extraordinary set of speakers, starting with a keynote by Ms. Stephanie Williams, who until recently was the acting special representative of the UN Secretary General in Libya, and followed by a very knowledgeable panel consisting of Dr. Patrick Quirk of the International Republican Institute, and also my colleague at Brookings, Dr. Francis Brown of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Dr. George Ingram, another distinguished colleague of mine at Brookings. I will introduce each of our speakers in more detail later on. Non-state armed actors, be they militants, terrorist, criminal groups, or pro-government militias, have been a defining feature of international relations and US foreign policy for the past 2 decades. Efforts to prevent their emergence and the emergence of violent conflict, or at least to mitigate their effects and improve government, has been at the center of US and international stabilization effort. From wars in Iraq, Somalia, Afghanistan, to areas of intense, highly violent criminality, such as in the Northern Triangle of Central America. However, many of the stabilization efforts have often been challenging to implement and often been challenged by competing priorities. In 2019, nonetheless, the US Congress recognized the crucial importance of stabilization efforts, elevating them to a level of law when it passed the Global Fragility Act that the Biden administration will now be implementing. In the few recent years, geopolitical situation has changed and now intersects with the issue of non-state armed actors. Heightened rivalries and power competition, the rise of the centrality of the Indo-Pacific region, however, in no way eliminate the role, impact, and indeed profound effect of non-state armed actors. The new geopolitics merely adds new layers to the issue and new complexities, as actors such as China and Russia are or will be increasingly interacting with non-state armed actors, sometimes fielding non-state armed actors such as private security companies themselves, and as many other actors in the international system. Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar also engage with them. But of course, it's not just simply external actors who engage with non-state armed actors. Local governments do so too, either by sponsoring militias that combat some of the criminal groups or militant groups or terrorist groups, or use non-state armed actors for delivering governance in areas where they are not able or willing to do so themselves. Examples abound from Bangladesh, Nigeria, to Colombia, Venezuela, and Jamaica. The COVID-19 pandemic is yet another significant factor in the relationship between states and non-state armed actors, changing the balance of power between the two toward non-state armed actors. Around the world, governments have faced catastrophic collapse of GDP. In many countries, the level of economic decline are in levels unseen really since World War II, not rarely 8%, 10% of GDP. The weakening of budget, of course, means that there will be further strain for resources to be devoted to policing, law enforcement, or even military actions. But we also need to recognize that many of these efforts struggled even prior to COVID. At the same time, the stabilization efforts that focus on improving good governance, improving economic livelihoods, trying to generate economic livelihoods will also be affected. At the time when the first year of COVID pushed some 150 million people into extreme poverty, and often did so in ways in which those that have lost their status in lower middle class and have been pushed back into extreme poverty did so in ways that required them to liquidate all of their human capital development assets. That means that they may no longer be able to recover their status even when the economies of the countries start growing. And they may languish in the context of lack of legal employment, often pushed into illicit economies and thus the hands of non-state armed actors for perhaps even a generation. That too strengthens non-state armed actors by giving them political capital and by strengthening their grip on local populations that they govern. And this is not simply a phenomenon of weak countries. We see the impact of COVID strengthening non-state armed actors, even in the United States. Right-wing armed groups in the US very actively capitalized on COVID, as did right-wing armed groups in Europe. However, amidst this overall difficult and picture, there is one bright spot that has recently emerged, and that bright spot is Libya, a country that 10 years ago experienced a revolution that deposed the Muammar Gaddafi regime. And what after the past decade then was a seemingly intractable tangle of divided political class, a multitude of fluid militias, both internal and external, and complexities and rivalry of regional powers, since October now seems to be experiencing a great window of opportunity to achieve significant improvements. And this window of opportunity has only been strengthened in February. To a large extent, this window of opportunity has arisen as a result of adroit, persistent, dedicated, and innovative facilitation, international mediation, and facilitation by the international community. There is no better person to start us in the conversation about fragility, stabilization effort, and non-state armed actors than Ms. Stephanie Williams, who has been one of the key architects of international mediation efforts in Libya. Until a few days ago, Ms. Williams served as the acting special representative of the UN Secretary General in Libya, having previously served as the UN Special Deputy Representative for Political Affairs. Ms. Williams has a distinguished career in the US State Department with many different deployments and assignments in the Middle East. I will highlight just a few. She was a charge d'affaires at the US Embassy in Tripoli in 2018. She also served as Deputy Chief of Mission in the US missions in Iraq, Jordan, and Bahrain. Ms. Williams, I am so thrilled and honored that you can join us today. I'm so impressed and hearty congratulations on your tremendous work in Libya. Please tell us about the experience and lessons there. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for this Brookings invitation and you, Vanda. And I really look forward to the discussion part of this event. But I will start on a bit of a contrarian note, as I'd actually like to challenge the use of the word non-state actor in the Libyan context. Because really, in my view, what dominates in Libya are quasi-state actors in the form of hundreds of armed groups at the national, provincial, and even local level that are either directly or indirectly supported by state institutions. And then we get the state institutions themselves are weakened and divided, as you noted. In the case of the Government of National Accord, the so-called GNA, which was the product of the 2015 Libyan political agreement, while it enjoys international recognition, it is the UN recognized government, it has lacked domestic legitimacy and has been in many ways unable to extend its writ much beyond the capital. In the case that there's a parallel executive in the East, the interim government, while it was able to garner some domestic legislative recognition, it also lacks significant popular legitimacy. So in fact, one can say that all current institutions in Libya are bereft of legitimacy, including the two legislative bodies, which are way beyond their shelf life. The last elections, for instance, for the High State Council occurred in 2012, and the last elections for the House of Representatives took place in 2014. So fundamentally, the country suffers from a crisis of legitimacy. the quasi-state actors, the armed groups, have morphed, from the days of the revolution to really become groups that are able to extract rent from the state directly via salaries. And in the case of some powerful armed groups, they're able to enjoy really a direct budget line, a dedicated and independent budget, bypassing the ministries such as the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, or the Ministry of Justice. These groups then benefit directly from a relationship to the Presidency Council, as is the case of many or most of the prominent Tripoli armed groups. The most recent example of this was President Sarraj's decree in January, just 1 month ago. And it was a decree that was essentially issued unilaterally by him to create yet another security agency under the Presidency Council to be run by a Tripoli armed group, a sort of Praetorian guard unit of sorts for the Presidency Council. And as I noted in my last Security Council briefing, which was delivered on January 28th, the multiplication of security agencies under the leadership of armed groups with overlapping responsibilities, unclear lines of command and control, and financed with public resources further erodes the state's security architecture, and it undermines the future security sector reforms and prospects for DDR, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration of these armed groups. And so there are other armed groups, while still extracting salaries from the state. And here I'll just say, 60% of the national budget, of the public budget, is devoted to public salaries. That gives you a sense of, and this is, a rentier economy, so perhaps in some ways not surprising. But these other armed groups, while they extract the salaries from the state, essentially function as criminal enterprises, trafficking in human beings, fuel, and weapons. In fact, some of these quasi-state actors run official and unofficial prisons, and official and unofficial migrant detention centers, which they use for profit. In some instances, these very armed groups who have attacked each other at the cost of innocent lives and property have been paid by different state entities. So we saw that was the case in the August-September 2018 attack on Tripoli, when groups from Misrata and Tarhuna were countered by state-financed armed groups who were defending the capital from Tripoli. The most infamous example, of course, was General Haftar's attack on Tripoli, which can in some ways be described as a state-funded civil war, in that many of Haftar's soldiers continued to receive salaries from the Tripoli government they were seeking to overthrow. So predation is not merely confined to the quasi-state actors. There's certainly, the armed groups have been predatory, but I have to say predation is also practiced by the full-time state actors. So in my mind, the situation in Libya brings to mind the St. Augustine parable of the pirate's encounter with the emperor, where St. Augustine tells the story of a pirate captured by Alexander the Great. "How dare you molest the sea?" asked Alexander. "Well, how dare you molest the whole world?" the pirate replied. "Because I do it with a little ship only. I am called a thief. You do it with a great navy, and you are called an emperor." In the case of Libya, you could argue that there's little to no distinction between the pirate and the emperor. The armed groups have predated on the state, which has in turn predated on the entire population, using state institutions and state-owned companies to fuel and sustain large-scale patronage networks. And we have occasionally, labeled the state actors who engage in predation as the Cravatta militia. So these are the militia in business suits. Just one example of the corrupt patronage network is the use of embassies and consulates. So Libya has more overseas diplomatic missions than the United States. And they use the diplomatic missions to feather nests by embedding in these missions numerous sort of loyal functionaries in the guise of things like they have health attaches, education attaches, defense or security attaches. I spoke to the former education minister, for instance, and he really tried to tackle the abuse and corruption in the health attaché, the education attaché network, but he sort of left in frustration because trying to, sort of enact reform within the system created too many enemies. So what we have seen in Libya is state actors for many years have profited from the privileged access to the official exchange rates. This has the good thing is this has been curtailed with the long-awaited unification of the exchange rate last month. But the fact is the concentration of the country's sovereign institutions, namely the Central Bank of Libya and the National Oil Corporation, not to mention the financial and economic institutions of the state in Tripoli, in the capital itself, has made the capital an attractive target for domestic armed groups because it's where the money is. And the domestic Libyan patronage and armed group networks are sustained and supported by international networks and nation states who see Libya as a geostrategic prize, ripe for the taking, given its abundant natural resources and a field upon which they can and have literally waged war over their ideological differences. These internationals have injected their own non-state or state-supported actors onto the Libyan arena in the form of over 20,000 mercenaries who are on the ground now, many of whom either fully or partially occupy at least 10 Libyan military bases. So into this complex web of the quasi-state actors and the state actors enters the international mediator seeking to end this interminable conflict over access to resources and power, and not to mention the debilitating corruption that plagues Libya. So, for those interested in the details of the mediation process, which much of it did take place in the context of COVID, and we can certainly get into those peculiarities. But if you want to read more about the mediation process and the next steps, I would point everyone to the article I co-authored with Jeff Feltman, which Brookings published yesterday. In short, UNSMIL, the mission in Libya, built a 3-track intra-Libyan process focusing particularly on the economic and security drivers of the conflict while seeking to renew the legitimacy of Libyan institutions through the political track. The progress made through these 3 UN-facilitated intra-Libyan tracks remains very fragile. It is a garden which is going to need a lot of tending, both by the United Nations itself and the international community. One thing in this mediation process that we tried to avoid was the temptation of the international mediator to pick winners. I don't believe that has been a successful strategy or in Libya or in other conflict areas historically. What we did instead was to broaden the participation, particularly in the economic and political tracks, to include groups that had not been represented in previous mediation efforts. For the political track, we sought to open it up to the public by using sub-tracks and the creative use of the digital dialogue platform that was developed by the UN Innovation Unit in New York. We then broadcast live to the Libyan public much of the deliberations, particularly during the last round in Geneva. In fact, according to one Libyan television station, one platform, they registered 1.7 million Libyans viewing and watching the proceedings according to this channel. And that's, if you look at a population of 7 million, that's between one quarter and 1/3 of the population. So where are we now? An interim executive has been produced. What the US government needs to do is it should quickly, and it has gotten behind the UN process, but it also now needs to really push the status quo actors who are loath to commit class suicide, including the parliament, to support the roadmap that was developed by the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which really is now the reference point, the marja'iyya for this whole process. The parliament needs to approve the new government, and the legislative bodies need to produce the framework for the elections, which have been established to take place on December 24th of this year. And polling in Libya since the Geneva meeting has shown strong support for the unification of the executive and even stronger support for the holding of the elections on time. Consistently, polling shows 70 to 80% of Libyans want these elections to take place on time in December, and they intend to participate in the electoral process. Once the new government is in place, the US should use its already good development and stabilization programming to help the government fulfill the discrete tasks ahead of it. And really, this is an interim executive. It needs to concentrate on very specific tasks. One of them is the electrical grid, which will collapse if it's not maintained urgently. There is also a need to, obviously, for the COVID pandemic, to ensure that resources get into the hands of the health authorities, and also into resources in general get into the hands of the municipalities. The US government should also continue its really excellent support for the High National Elections Commission, which is going to have its plate full leading up to the December 24th elections. The other thing is, the U.S. does stabilization programming now. Some of that's done through the UN Development Program stabilization platform, and some of it is done directly. That needs to continue. And here's where, as the situation continues to calm, as the institutions unite, as you look at more institutional reform, you need to be able to reach those areas, and particularly those cities in Libya that have been affected most direly by the conflict. And that was reflected in the Berlin conclusions of the conference that was held last year in Berlin, where there was actually identification of cities in the east like Derna and Benghazi, who've been afflicted over the past decade. Terrible destruction witnessed in those cities. Marzouk and Sebha in the south. Tripoli, of course, the most recent war on Tripoli has devastated particularly southern Tripoli, so that if the international community, the United States, other donors working with the United Nations ensure that those areas get help quickly in the form of stabilization and then ultimately reconstruction assistance, I think that will also go a long way towards, calming the situation in the country. Look, in the Q&A, I'm happy to get into DDR and security sector reform. There are many plans that have been written over the last 10 years. They adorn shelves, of many embassies, of the mission and in government offices in Libya, but conditions just at that point where
it appears that Stephanie's line has frozen. Patrick or George or Francis, are you hearing Stephanie?
Yeah.
You're muted now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Your line froze just at the very end for a few seconds, but thank you so much for the tremendous work in Libya and beyond, and also for those excellent remarks, reminding us right at the beginning about the labels and the fact that seemingly non-state armed actors might be quasi-state actors, as you labeled it. And that is, of course, the larger issue that many non-state actors govern often govern in far more direct ways than the states and local populations experience their rule far more directly, and sometimes govern at least in ways that are no worse than the state governs, particularly when the state engages so heavily in predation, like in Libya, where the state really is not a provider of public goods, but rather a mafia bazaar, the purpose of which is to issue exception from rule of law to one's clique. Of course, this recognition that the non-state armed actors might have great legitimacy and great political capital with local populations, and the states might be seen as worse than the local alternative, is fundamental to devising good stabilization policies. Patrick, I will turn to you to reflect on this, as you have been one of the key architects of stabilization efforts. Dr. Patrick Quirk is a senior director of the Center for Global Impact and the International Republican Institute. And I'm also delighted to say a wonderful colleague in the initiative of Non-State Armed Actors at Brookings, a non-resident fellow in the foreign policy program. He previously served in the US Secretary of State's policy planning staff in the Department of State, and was the lead advisor for fragile states, conflict, and stabilization. He was also one of the key conceptualizers of the new US approach to fragile state. And prior to his work on policy planning, Dr. Quirk served in the Department of State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, again as the chief political scientist and lead author of the 2018 Stabilization Assistance Review. And I also very highly recommend Patrick's great book, Great Powers, Weak States, and Insurgency, Explaining Internal Threat Alliances. Patrick, over to you.
Thanks so much, Vanda. It's great to be here. And congratulations again to Stephanie on the recent breakthrough. Really enjoyed your remarks. I'll do three things in my remarks. First, set the stage by outlining what the Global Fragility Act and associated strategy are and where non-state armed actors factor in. Second, outline ways that current US policy might hinder dealing with such actors over the course of strategy implementation. And finally, provide a few recommendations for us to talk about for how we could potentially overcome these challenges. So let's start with the Global Fragility Act, or the GFA. In December of last year, the US released its first strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability, as called for in the GFA. Implementing the strategy will include selecting priority countries and regions to focus up to $1.1 billion in foreign assistance over 10 years on conflict prevention and stabilization. As the US begins implementing the strategy, non-state armed actors will be one of the main challenges that it faces. From the Northern Triangle to East Africa, wherever the Biden administration decides to focus, it will confront this problem. So recognizing this challenge, the new strategy smartly calls for, quote, reducing the destabilizing impact of non-state armed actors, unquote, as a key objective. However, the document provides very few details on how it will accomplish the same. And that's part of the reason why we're here today, to talk about potential solutions. But before we can do that, I think we need to understand how current US policy might hinder effectively dealing with this problem set in general and in the context of GFA implementation. Where three factors stand out. First, there is still a dissonance between security operations, development policy, and counterterrorism laws. US law does limit policy options for engaging non-state armed actors designated as terrorist organizations or with links to them, including defectors. This is certainly understandable in principle, but the regulation has hampered some US stabilization efforts like those in northern Nigeria. The second constraint is that the US often prioritizes a state-centric approach to engagement. In some cases, the US understandably avoids bypassing the central government because its buy and ensures foreign assistance avoids delegitimizing the state. But this capital-focused approach can have limitations. It's especially pronounced in cases where the government may indeed be predatory and be perpetuating conflict, and therefore, perhaps different route to stability could involve working with non-state armed actors. The third and final constraint is that the United States doesn't have a policy outlining which non-state armed actors are acceptable to engage, whether through diplomacy or other support. Current US stabilization policy defines it as a, quote, political endeavor to create conditions where locally legitimate authorities and systems can peaceably manage conflict. But the USG hasn't developed a definition of local legitimacy, metrics for measuring it, or other codified criteria to consider when deciding whether to engage. So looking ahead to address some of these issues and to our discussion today, maximize the fragility strategy's efficacy, the new administration can consider three things. First, developing guidance that defines parameters for engaging non-state armed actors to include a definition of legitimacy, criteria for considering the membership of these organizations, past crimes, objectives, and whether they align with stability and US interests. This is an incredibly thorny issue, but I think it really needs to be addressed. Second, in crafting country implementation plans for the strategy, the US can outline different scenarios, methods, and plans for engagement with non-state armed actors and understand their benefits and consequences. If deemed appropriate, the US can start with lower risk engagement, understand the results, and adapt accordingly. These plans also need to take a hard look at whether the partner government is part of the problem. Third and finally, when non-state armed actors are demobilized and the reintegration period has started, the US can consider providing select groups the resources and skills to govern effectively and engage in political outlets and processes. Even when the US can't directly engage or support such groups given existing laws and related constraints, it can help partner governments craft strategies that do include such groups. In closing, the Biden administration has an opportunity to meaningfully reduce fragility in some of the places that matter most for US interests. Doing so will require certainly making good on the strategy's commitment to addressing the underlying political nature of conflict, as well as re-examining and revamping the US approach to engaging non-state armed actors. I'm really looking forward to other thoughts from Stephanie, Francis, and George on how we go about doing this. Thanks again, Vanda.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. Tremendous. You hit on some of the key challenges in dealing with stabilization, both how do we address the legitimacy that local actors, whether they are government, pro-government, or anti-government, in fact have, and the legal framework that, while designed to deprive anti-government terrorist non-state armed actors of material resources, in fact, often critically hampers ability to redress their political legitimacy, their local capital. The tough issues that I would posit might even suggest really a review of whether there should be much better off-ramp from designation such as global terrorist or specially designated crime groups like the Maras in Central America. All those issues are issues, Francis, that you grappled with in senior policy decision-making roles. Dr. Francis Brown is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in the program on democracy, conflict, and governance. And prior to her appointment, she served both in the Obama and Trump administrations in the White House on the National Security Council, at USAID in the Office of Transition Initiatives, as well as prior to those important roles, she worked in non-governmental organizations, very much grappling with issues of stabilization risk assessment. I particularly want to highlight Dr. Brown's role on the NSC, where she helped manage the policy processes related to democracy support, political transition, and post-conflict stabilization efforts. And would suggest here that the issue of post-conflict stabilization has become even more complex because often we don't really get to the post-conflict stage. Instead, the conflict goes through multiple mutations, intensification, perhaps decline, but is never quite over, which is yet another issue to grapple with in stabilization, including as it pertains to the Global Fragility Act. Dr. Brown, please.
Thank you so much, Vanda. It's really a pleasure to be here with these colleagues. It's exciting to hear the latest from Libya from Stephanie. And More broadly, beyond Libya, I think it's a really tremendous time to be talking about the agenda for non-state actors and global conflicts. I do think the Biden administration has an incredible opportunity to really make good on the promise of the Global Fragility Act. And it's exciting to be talking about some of the ways that they could do that. So now on the Global Fragility Act, the question does come down to the brass tacks of implementation. And as Patrick notes, I think a key part of that will be really grappling with some key dilemmas on non-state armed actors. Within my remarks, I just want to illustrate a few of those dilemmas regarding non-state armed actors that I think the administration will need to take on board. So the three dilemmas I would highlight are, first, that COVID has changed the relationship between non-state actors and governing authorities in many fragile states around the world in ways that Vanda alluded to as well. So how do we incorporate that into our strategic planning on fragile states? The second dilemma is that we need to think about how we set policy on non-state armed actors who are not our adversaries, but instead are our partners in many places around the world. And then the third dilemma is, how do we set policy on non-state armed actors who reside in a vast swath of shades of gray, or who may indeed be changing their stripes in ways that Vanda just mentioned as well. So first dilemma, COVID has really scrambled the respective positions and power dynamics between many non-state armed actors and governments in many fragile states around the world. The Global Fragility Act talks about the need to bolster legitimate governance to address populations' needs. And when we do our own assistance from the US government and donor side, we often, although not exclusively, work with host governments. We do support civil society in some instances, but our primary relationship diplomatically and assistance-wise is with the national capital, is with the governing authority. COVID has really changed the respective roles of many non-state groups. In many places, they have stepped into the void to deliver services that frankly, the government, the official government, is either unwilling or unable to do during COVID. So just a few illustrations of this specific to the COVID time period. The group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS in Syria, has been stepping up its own COVID response. It made a mask factory, it opened isolation centers, been distributing COVID materials. In Iraq, the national government had a pretty underwhelming pandemic response in many places, and that's provided an opportunity for informal militias called the Popular Mobilization Forces to respond in their place. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, Hezbollah has undertaken its own response to COVID, provided its own services. More recently in Afghanistan, the Taliban has been backing and facilitating an internationally sponsored vaccine drive. So these are all ways in which groups are stepping up. Of course, many non-armed groups are stepping up as well, but today our focus is on armed groups. In addition, a lot of non-state groups are instrumentalizing the pandemic for their own propaganda purposes, for their own expansion of control. We've seen this in Somalia with Shabab, who claims that the virus was a crusader origin, being spread by crusader forces. ISIS in Iraq encouraged an increase in attacks while Western and government forces were either distracted or retrenched with the pandemic. So there's a lot of ways in which groups are instrumentalizing this. It's not all bad news in that regard. There are some places where the pandemic has weakened non-state actors' hands because they haven't been able to respond, and the the population judges them accordingly. So by some reports in Somalia, Shabab initially denied the existence of the virus or denied how it was being spread. But then it realized that its popularity had previously waned during famines because it wasn't seen to be responding effectively. So it then sort of changed course and aimed to respond. So in short, the pandemic has scrambled a lot of these dynamics. It's a very mixed picture globally, but it's just all to say that as we do think about actually crafting fragility strategies for the countries that are selected under the Global Fragility Act, those will need to be really grafted onto a situation where the power dynamics have shifted, and we need to update our analysis and our modes of gathering information to reflect that. Second dilemma, very quickly, is setting policy on non-state armed actors who are our adversaries, who are not our adversaries, who are in fact our partners. So as Patrick mentions, the Global Fragility Strategy has a really brief mention of non-state armed actors, and it essentially says we will attempt to reduce their influence. But that obviously doesn't encompass or apply to the vast swath of non-state armed actors with whom the US military has partnered over recent years. The US military has rolled out an increasing reliance on working by, with, and through local partners for reasons that often make sense from a military planning perspective. But these partnerships often have longer-term political ramifications and complexities that, as we think about the Global Fragility Act, I think we'll need to grapple with. Syria has one particularly prominent example that many viewers might be familiar with. This is the US military partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. This was an incredibly effective military partnership to combat ISIS in the east of the country. And then the SDF has gone on to set up administration quite quickly in the east of the country. So very effective from a military criterion perspective, but has raised political complexities. Our NATO ally Turkey views this group as a terror or linked with terrorist groups. There's also been human rights concerns about the inclusivity of the SDF's governance, although there are some reports that's improved recently. So I'm not here to pass judgments on the merits of this partnership, but I do think it's imperative that going forward, as we grapple with the Global Fragility Act's implementation and think about the long term, these are 10-year plans, we really take head on the complexities of what these by, with, and through relationships have wrought. And I think this goes well beyond Syria. We're working with local non-state partners in many fragile states where we may get involved with the GFA. So that's another one to grapple with. Third dilemma, addressing the vast swath of non-state armed actors who reside somewhere in the shades of gray, or who evolve very quickly in their disposition or in their orientation. So International Crisis Group had a recent piece kind of highlighting this dilemma as regards, again, to Syria, noting this group HTS has proclaimed that it's changed its disposition. It's presenting itself as a more pragmatic governing actor, one that doesn't take part in external terrorist organizations, that allows aid flows, etc. I'm not in a position to pass judgment on that particular group or where it is, but I do think there's a broader point to be made here about how the US thinks about whether groups or individuals can ever make that evolution from terrorist to reconcilable. Vanda noted the need for off-ramps, and I think that's something that we will be facing again and again in many of these fragile states. I would argue that if we are aiming to reorient our foreign policy to rely less on kinetic tools of counterterrorism like drone strikes, it behooves us all to have clear benchmarks and accountability measures that we can point to that say this is sort of how this process happens in our mind. We do have a delisting process that we can do, but to my mind, we could probably make it more standardized or have more benchmarks that the other side can understand. This may not be feasible in many cases or realistic in many cases, but I think it's something we can all think about that. Going along with that, I think if we on the US government side are really to implement this kind of shift, we will need better ways of understanding these armed groups, this swath of armed groups, probably more expeditionary diplomacy to understand that, and really be able to get the analysis we need. So that very briefly, three dilemmas, none of them easy answers, but I'm really looking forward to the conversation where we grapple a little bit more with the exciting agenda for the Global Fragility Act.
Well, thank you so much, Francis. Great comments as well. And, I particularly note the issue that it's not just the Irans and Venezuelas and Russias of the world that are dealing intimately, sponsoring, supporting non-state armed actors. Of course, this has been a core of US foreign policy and counterterrorism strategy for the past 2 decades and way before going to the Cold War era, whether it was the Mujahideen of the 1980s or the 13, 15, 17 type of militias that we have been supporting in Afghanistan, and that are at best a loose cannon, often very directly implicated in undermining any vestiges of good governance, even as they promised at various times to fight groups like the Taliban. And your other point about the stripes, the colors evolving over time is also fundamental. Many of the so-called non-state partners might be a partner at time X, but at times X+2, they might have quite easily adopted very divergent agendas and possibly even quite agendas that directly contradict our objectives. But it's no way easier with the states either, George. If I can turn to you, a core issue why the challenge of stabilization has been so acute is, of course, that the state partners often are as problematic, intractable, have divergent parochial agenda as the non-state armed actors. So I look to Dr. George Ingram, my colleague at Brookings, senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development, in the program on global economy and development at Brookings, to reflect on dealing with states and strengthening state partner capacity. Dr. Ingram's professional career has focused on these issues across a variety of agencies in the US Congress, in the executive branch, as well as in the nonprofit sector. He served he still serves as chair emeritus of the US Global Leadership Coalition and a co-chair of Modernizing Foreign Assistance. From 98 to 2000, Dr. Ingram was the principal deputy assistant administrator of the Agency for International Development, USAID, with his responsibility being on focusing on state assistance programs in the Soviet Union, in place where many states have experienced significant meltdown on state capacities and need to rebuild institutions, even as institutions would be pervaded by mafia type actors. And from 73 to 95, Dr. Ingram was a senior staff member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He had very many other distinguished appointments. Dr. Ingram, thank you for your thoughts on how to deal with the states.
Thank you, Vanda, and nice to be with my colleagues today on this panel. I'm going to broaden the conversation beyond just non-state armed actors to all non-state actors and state actors too, and how the donors deal with them. And I'm going to make two basic points. One is that the donors must have an overall frame of coherence and adaptability for assistance to be effective. And two, that the way they deal with non-state actors has to be one of listening to help them build trust. On the donor frame, there are 5 issues I will raise. One, and Patrick touched on this when he talked about the dissonance within the US government. There must be coherence and consistency across government activities. And this applies in 2 areas. It applies within the US government and among the donors and with the host government. Within the US government, the new strategy on preventing conflict and promoting stability, like the Global Fragility Act and the USIP report on fragility, calls for cross-agency strategy and operational framework, but outlines in only very broad terms agency roles and responsibilities. The success I've seen in other initiatives is based on 2 key factors. One is strong White House backing. Frances can speak to this possibly, given her background at the NSC. And secondly, operational control placed in the hands of the agency, principally responsible for funding and operations. With other donors, there needs to be a donor platform for ensuring coordination and consistency among donors and with local stakeholders, both the host government and other key actors in the country. It can involve pool funding, but at a minimum, there needs to be a common frame, a common strategy that donors are working from, and coordination and compatibility across all activities, both with the host government and with the private sector and the non-state actors. Secondly, a key element of this is local ownership, engaging the local stakeholders, the government, business, civil society, community groups and leaders to set the right priorities and in designing and implementing the programs. Third, implementation decisions must be made in the country. The field must be empowered with the authority to make decisions and adjust programming. This comes together with the issue of adaptability. To make these two prior elements of local ownership and empowering the field to make decisions requires flexibility and adaptability. Placing funding for fragile countries in a flexible account with no programmatic earmarks and with notwithstanding authority, as was provided in the Freedom Support Act for the transition in the former Soviet Union, and is now provided in the Complex Crisis Fund in the Global Fragility Act. The hard part of this is in this era of intense partisanship and years of distrust between the Congress and the executive branch, is how to develop trust from the Congress. How to get the Congress to trust that the authority to empower decision-making in the field with the ability to adapt activities according to the changing dynamics will be used responsibly. This can be approached through maintaining a close consultative relationship with the Hill, through providing committees of jurisdiction with full access to data and consultations on planning and policy program deliberations, and possibly embedding a member of the field implementation team with congressional committee staff. As an aside, I will confess that this is a need I've been grappling with for some years. And I would invite those listening today who have creative thoughts on this to share them with us. The fifth area in this arena is to account for the political. Technical solutions must account and incorporate local political dynamics. Assistant programs tend to be designed according to technical requirements without adequate attention to local political dynamics. So the second area of how to engage at the local level, the basic point is the need to build trust, to listen and to engage in local ownership. What is a common ingredient in fragility? It is lack of trust in local leaders and government. How is trust built? It's built through government meeting the concerns and needs of the populace, through services that meet their needs. What does this require? It requires listening. It requires listening at the local level. Ritu Sharma, 10 years ago, taught us in Teach a Woman to Fish that the poor, that the forgotten have solutions to their problems. What they need is a little help and a little empowerment. The new biography, The Good American, about Bob Gersony's international work, is instructive in what can be learned by going to the community level, by listening to what the problems and concerns are and tease out the solutions. I learned this when I was at AID in the late 90s, overseeing assistance to the former Soviet Union. AID engaged the Aga Khan Foundation to figure out how to advance girls' education in Muslim communities in Central Asia. This was Muslims talking to Muslims. At the start of the effort, the implementation staff did nothing for several weeks, several months. And I emphasize the fact that they did nothing but visit the communities and talk to local leaders and citizens about the values of girls' education, about their own interest, about their concerns, and to find out where the opening might be. They found that opening and they successfully got those communities to bring girls into schools. The motto here is to listen, and keep listening, and engage local actors, engaging their priorities and designing the solutions to their problems, because they have the solutions. Thank you.
Excellent, George. Very powerful comments as well, particularly highlighting the need to listen to local communities and to allow and foster local solutions, the local coping mechanisms that populations develop in dealing with non-state armed actors. That is often challenging for US policy and international assistance efforts because it might involve not challenging non-state armed actors that we do not like, and rather living with them and under them in conditions that are suboptimal perhaps, but nonetheless better than alternatives. Also, your focus on escaping the pressure of burn rates, having to execute programs very rapidly, having to spend money very rapidly so as not to lose money for the next funding cycle is a fundamental. And finally, the issue that all transitions or stabilizations are about politics and fundamentally about changing political balances of power, hence extremely uncomfortable to those who are losing in the process of power, whether they are parochial governing entities, state or non-state, or other coalitions. I will now move to the question and answer period, moderated with our keynote speaker, Ms. Williams, as well as the entire panel, and take questions from the audience. They have been submitted in writing before. They continue to be submitted through Twitter and other means. Stephanie, if I can start with you with one question that has just come in that I think is very pertinent, particular to you. You spoke about the big innovation of the digital outreach and digital means of bringing in transparency to deliberation that allow the vast segments of the Libyan population now to observe what's happening, but also put pressure then on their presumed representative. So the question that has come in is, what are other UN efforts, programs thinking on bringing more of these digital tools to other settings? And also, is there any thinking, planning in the UN about using artificial intelligence for peacekeeping or stabilization efforts?
Thanks very much. So yes, I mean, I think, and this gets back to, you know, the complexities of doing mediation in the context of COVID. So, you know, we couldn't have physical meetings, and therefore we had to move both. We were on Zoom, you know, with the Libyan participants in the 3 tracks, as well as with the international community, with the countries who participate in the Berlin track and the working groups there. But as we were moving, you know, towards the physical meeting, particularly of the political track, the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, it coincided with this effort that was being undertaken by the Innovation Unit at UN headquarters in New York, which was to launch these digital dialogues. They did it in a couple of missions. I'm familiar with the work in the Libya mission, and then I understand they did it in Yemen as well. So Libya is a Facebook country. It's not a Twitter country. It's a Facebook country. That's a lot of Libyans spend an enormous amount of time on Facebook. But it is also a country in which there's a lot of interest in engaging online. And so we started these digital dialogues like in late October, and they ran really through January 31st was the last one, right before the meeting in Geneva. And like immediately we were attracting like huge numbers of Libyans. So there's a ceiling on how many you can bring into the digital dialogue, and we always exceeded the ceiling. In other words, there were always people who were, you know, in the waiting room. And I don't know the technicalities of all of that. Maybe that's something that, you know, can be improved on so you can even get more participants. But suffice it to say, like in each of the dialogues, digital dialogues, we had 1,000 at least 1,000 Libyans active online. Most of them, by the way, younger Libyans. So really up to the age of about 40, you saw, quite a lot of participation, more weighted towards men than women, but the participation rate of women improved, with each dialogue that was conducted. And I participated directly in 4 of the dialogues, and it was just a really good way to take the pulse, run instant polling, but also in the case of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, to really feed directly, to the participants in the dialogue forum, feedback from the Libyan public, and we complemented that with the sub-tracks that we ran during the dialogue as well, where we had rapporteurs from women's, youth, and municipality sub-tracks reporting to the dialogue forum members, their vision for the way forward. So what I did specifically before the Geneva dialogue was I solicited questions for the presentations we had 45 candidates who participated in a presentation and question answer session that was live streamed into Libya, initially through UN web TV, but then picked up by the Libyan television stations. And so we were able, these were not questions that were posed by the United Nations. These were questions that were posed by the Libyans themselves. And so I think that also, gave it a much higher degree of legitimacy. In terms of planning on AI, I would have to defer. I've now left the United Nations, so I can't really speak for what the United Nations is doing currently. And I'd have to defer to the brilliant people in New York who set up the digital dialogue platform. Thank you.
Thanks. Perhaps that's a topic that our Brookings initiative on artificial intelligence can tackle. The initiative looks at a whole variety of issues, of its impact on middle class, of its impact on democratic processes, authoritarian processes, crime, not simply how to tackle crime, but how anti-crime tools provide backdoors for all kinds of other social impact. So the international stabilization, peacekeeping dimension, perhaps another element that we can be exploring over time. Francis, let me turn to you with a question that has come up in different from different people, that has been submitted multiple times, and that's also a primary question on my mind. When we think about the Global Fragility Act, the act is to select, or the tasking is to select primary areas, perhaps 5 key countries. I would kind of broaden that beyond the Fragility Act in a new era of new geopolitics, where we arguably should start thinking about prioritizing what conflicts we engage in with the United States. We might also be asking, how do we prioritize areas where we engage in stabilization? What should be the criteria to indicate that a particular country should receive significant amount of significant resources? And should there be some countries where we say, well, we will stay out of this country. We are not going to be really investing very strongly in terms of time, material resources, diplomatic capital, other forms of engagement. How do we prioritize?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And I think you're right, Vanda. In this particular era, we can't stabilize everywhere or go into every fragile state. I think we need to prioritize based on US national interests vis-a-vis that locale, and US values, and realistic prospect for change in terms of host government commitment and other factors. So in terms of how we do that, how do we select 5 countries or 10 countries in this process? I could put on my scholar PhD hat and paint you a way in which we can have a really robust, empirically driven process for this. We have indicators for political instability. We have indicators for state collapse. We have lots of indicators for quality of government. We have ways we could overlay that with US national interests, potential for a country to export a negative externality like terrorism, like pandemic disease, like migration. There's all ways that we could actually put all these factors together, have our intel community or analytic community crunch the numbers and figure out what are the 5 or 10 countries we should be addressing. However, I will then put on my policymaker hat, having owned this process or a predecessor process at the NSC for a while. And I will tell you that no country selection and implementation will work if the ambassador in that country is not bought in, if the mission director, if the USAID mission is not bought in, if the regional bureaus at state in particular are not bought into that country. And this is for understandable reasons. If you imagine you're an ambassador and country X, and you go to your host government counterpart and say, congratulations, we selected you as the most fragile state. We're going to invest through the next 10 years. You can imagine how that's a challenging sell. So this is for very reasonable reasons, but in reality, I think for all the good work that's being done on the analytic side of country selection, I think we need to be real that politics, the importance of politics and political will starts in our own government. So what I think that means as a policy recommendation for the US government thinking about this is why it's essential that State Department leadership at the highest level really signals the importance of this act and implementing the Global Fragility Act over time. This is important why we need continued bipartisan congressional support for implementation going forward. Obviously, there's been a lot of bipartisan support to get it over the line, but since this is a 10-year endeavor, we need to keep up that attention. And we need signaling from the White House that this is important because that's the way that I think we ensure regional bureaus, ambassadors, et cetera, will be supportive and bought in. I'll leave it there.
Thanks. And perhaps the phrasing that it's not about the most fragile one might help both local U.S. Missions as well as the host governments to buy into it, that it's other forms of importance as opposed to the negative one. But I'm very glad that you hit the issue of...
I'll let the diplomats be more diplomatic than I was just there. I trust them too.
I was very pleased that you mentioned the realistic prospect for change as being an important criterion. One that I would say often is absent from policy, where the tyranny of sunk costs, tyranny of prior engagement, prior diplomatic and other relationships often trumps the issue of that despite more resources being added, the conflict dynamics might not change, and that a wiser, if cold-blooded, U.S. foreign policy might in fact dictate disengagement, or at least disengagement in some form. And I'm also glad that you brought in the issue of terrorism, the potential spillovers of negative externalities, terrorism being one. Of course, that's been a key principle, key organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy since 9/11, in the same way that opposing the Soviet Union was during Cold War. But the impact on the lives and well-being of U.S. people is far more dramatically impacted by COVID. Almost 500,000 Americans so far have died of COVID. Just the latest statistic that the first half a year of COVID diminished U.S. life expectancy by 1 year. Extraordinary number, disproportionately borne by minorities such as Black Americans. Yet, what is the U.S. death rate as a result of terrorism, at least in homeland? We're talking about low thousands in the 20 years, but it's given such priority focus as opposed to, for example, devoting resources to preventing habitat destruction in tropical areas as a way to mitigate zoonosis, the emergence of viral diseases jumping from animals to people. So the cold-blooded national security assessment would say far greater impact on well-being, material, physical, very survival of mitigating habitat destruction as opposed to terrorism, yet very different in practice operationalization. Or at least up to now, very different operationalization. We'll see what the Biden administration does. The other complicated factor, of course, in the stabilization agenda, Patrick, is that we are no longer the only actor in the stabilization agenda. We now have countries such as Russia and China offering their assistance to countries that feel weak. Russia, in particular, has built a wide set of relations with countries in Africa, offering the support of private security companies, embedding Russian advisors, often getting both political and diplomatic resources, but also economic access as a result. And China has vastly expanded its engagement with countries in Africa, Latin America, from promoting platforms such as safe cities, the anti-crime digital artificial intelligence system to combat crime. So, and their view of governance, the view of governance of Russia and China, and for that matter, other actors like the United Arab Emirates, is often very different than ours. What is good governance might look very radically different to how US policy has defined good governance. How do we deal with this competition in promoting good governance? How does that intersect with US stabilization effort and the implications for the Global Fragility Act?
Yeah, thanks, Wanda. Great question. There are two parts to the response. One looks at broader US engagement vis-a-vis democracy, assistance, foreign policy, and the second links more directly to the discussion today on conflict prevention and stabilization. So starting with the former, I think the U.S. can continue to work with partner countries to help inoculate their political systems from interference by the Chinese Communist Party and the Kremlin. I mean, China and Russia are both undermining democratic institutions and empowering illiberal actors across the world. Chinese government-linked companies are exploiting and exacerbating governance gaps in vulnerable countries, using a mix of corruption and lack of transparency to conclude deals that benefit elites' private interests while undermining political accountability. Russia is doing much of the same, using strategic corruption to prop up and co-opt allies within countries and undermine democratic actors with ties to the US and EU. We can go on and on. In terms of what to do about it, I mean, currently you see the White House is already sharply calling out Beijing and Moscow for their meddling abroad and oppression at home. This is good. It should urge allies to do more of the same, explicitly recognize, preempt, and punish the threats to democracy from the CCP and Kremlin. And this should be an agenda item for every call Secretary of State Blinken has with bilateral counterparts that are facing these threats. To galvanize additional pressure, though, the U.S. could push NATO, an alliance centered on protecting the principles of democracy, after all, to recognize China's threat to democracy in its strategic doctrine, to call out interference, and to levy consequences for this action. Linking Chinese and Russian activity in conflict prevention and stabilization to today's discussion, you're right, stabilization has very much become another arena for competition with our rivals. This is something that Frances and her colleague Daphne McCurdy nicely outlined in a recent paper, and something Jason Fritz and I explored in an article for Brookings last year, where we termed this contested stabilization. Related to GFA implementation, certainly competition with China, Russia, and even Iran should be an aspect of country-level plans, but I would caution against being too alarmist. I think the analysis of the impact of engagement by these actors needs to be evidence-based, and certainly depending on where we select, the plan should articulate the specific ways in which these different adversaries exacerbate fragility and contributes to violence, and prescribe evidence-based solutions for each country's activity. Really great question and very important topic.
Indeed, will be, how do we deal with engagement of China and Russia will be one of the dominant vectors of what the Biden administration will need to think about. I would also emphasize, or one aspect of your response, Patrick, we should not be too alarmist, and we should arguably avoid the trap of the Cold War, of feeling that we need to inject programs any and every time Russia and China are there, that we ipso facto as a result needs to be engaging, and particularly need to be engaging in support of the rival to the actors that Russia and China embrace. George, one question has come in that asks about the role of broader civil society and exactly connects with your remarks about listening to local communities, listening to local civil society. And specifically, the question asks, how can that be amplified in US foreign policy to combat corruption and to combat the problematic predatory practices by states, something that's been at the core of US foreign policy and international engagement for a long time. And I very much welcome your thoughts. How can we better strengthen, engage civil society for the purpose of reducing state corruption?
I think we can do it through several ways. One way we can do it is through the host government. And I use the example of what AID and Eurasia Foundation are doing in the Ukraine, in which they are helping the government move government services online to a digital platform. They're creating the ability for e-procurement. And the government of Ukraine claims that over the last 7 years, that has saved, I think it's $5 billion. And it has removed from the procurement process and from the process of issuing licenses for businesses in the tax area. It's removed that middleman paperwork where the corruption is. And it is done in a public, transparent fashion so that the public knows. And along with that is a public forum where the public can respond, can complain. So this combination of putting the government services online and having a digital platform where the citizens can engage and report on how that's working has made a big difference in Ukraine. I think secondly, the US government can train and help give civil society groups the capacity to advocate with government, the capacity to mobilize public opinion, to train civil society groups how to analyze government policies and how to engage with government and how to report on how the government is providing services and meeting the needs of the government. So building up the capacity of civil society organizations has demonstrated in various countries the ability to chip away at corruption.
Thanks. The question of corruption is, of course, so fundamental to Libya as well, and to sustaining the process that Libya has been going through, Stephanie. And also the complexity of the external actors, the Russia in particularly, various of the Middle Eastern countries, Egypt, as well as European countries being so thickly involved in the Libya context, yes, and yet is another complexity with the Libyan actors asking for the departure of all foreign forces, private security companies, militias, something that might not happen. Can you reflect with us on these? Can you help us reflect about these two issues? Corruption in the Libyan context, how to mitigate it, such as to get to better electricity delivery, and then, of course, the external actors that are so heavily impinging on domestic dynamics, internal dynamics in Libya.
Okay, so one of the things that we did in the mission when Hassan Salama recruited me as his deputy for political affairs, he asked, and he had recognized early on in his tenure sort of the political economy of the Libya file and the need to focus really on, you know, economic issues, the underlying drivers of the conflict, you know, which is essentially a conflict over resources and power. So how do you get to this? You start a process of economic reform. You start a process, well, eventually, which will lead to, you know, unifications of critical institutions, sovereign institutions like the Central Bank of Libya, We worked, for instance, on, and it's underway now, took 2 years to accomplish, but we now have an international audit being conducted of the central bank, the main branch in Tripoli and the parallel branch in the east. All of this, to really increase transparency on how the people's money, and when this is a country, the majority of the public budget is derived from oil sales and oil revenues, increase transparency, but also increase, accountability and improve, how the systems of, how this money is being spent, but also to reduce the ability of the quasi-state actors, to extract rent, and this gets into really what needs to happen in terms of DDR, in terms of disentangling the quasi-state actors from the government institutions. So I'll give you one example. The prisons. So the major prisons in Tripoli are run by quasi-state actors. They are not run by the Ministry of Justice. They are run by armed groups. Armed groups use, the prisons to, for instance, extort, money from the families of prisoners. Like, for instance, if they need a medication, they have to pay. Who gets that money? The money goes mostly to the armed group. So DDR will help to disentangle this relationship and to return, a management of things like the prisons to the proper institutions. Economic reform, will reduce the opportunity for armed groups, but also predatory state actors to abuse the current, dysfunction, division, and lack of transparency and accountability. And there's a lot of work to be done on that file at large. But corruption is just a huge problem in Libya, and it undermines any confidence in the ability of the state to be able to deliver, particularly at the local level. In terms of the departure of mercenaries, which was called for in the October 23rd ceasefire agreement that was signed by the so-called 5+5 Joint Military Commission, they did set themselves a very ambitious deadline of 90 days. Of course, that 90-day deadline came and went on January 23rd. But that, they are still quite determined. The 5+5 just held their 7th round of negotiations in the city of Sirte, where their headquarters is located. They addressed the international community through the Berlin Process Security Working Group. I attended that meeting before I departed the mission. And again, they reiterated that they would like to see they reiterated their demand that these forces have to depart the country. So the fact that the deadline is passed, does not make it any less legitimate or more binding on these countries, companies, whoever it is that's bringing, these guys into Libya needs to take them out.
Excellent, thank you very much. George, I have one question specifically directed to you that I would like to raise. I think is very valuable for all kinds of stabilization efforts beyond the GFA, namely that OTI had many authorities and flexibilities with respect to on-the-spot decisions in the field. That is the Office of Transition Initiatives within USAID. And it was unbound, liberated from the earmarks, restrictions that other agencies often have to deal with. What are the biggest obstacles to expanding the authorities and flexibilities that OTI has been able to enjoy to other agencies and bureaus?
I wish I knew the answer to that question because I've been working on it for 20 years. But the Congress has given flexible authorities where it's gotten excited, where there's been a big change, the SEED Act to help Eastern Europe, the Freedom Support Act for the former Soviet Union, the MCC, the PEPFAR. Those programs don't have earmarks. And the first two have notwithstanding authorities. So first and foremost, you've got to get the Congress interested. the Congress got halfway there with with the Fragility Act. Embedded in there is sort of the concept that we should get away from earmarks in directives. So the Congress is sort of half pregnant on the fragility aspect. And I think what we need to do is take them up on that. The administration needs to push the pilot countries, and it needs to double down with the Congress and saying, okay, let's go further in the direction you're saying, and let's not have any directives from Washington on these programs. We're going to be totally transparent with you. Give us 3 years, give us 5 years to demonstrate this works. Beyond that, it's one of the problems is that we have so many domestic interest groups that for good reasons want an earmark for health or education or democracy in the Foreign Assistance Act, in the appropriations. And we haven't convinced them to look at the broader perspective of what it takes, or what development takes, that the development takes all of the above and more and needs to be fine-tuned to a particular country. So I think better educating the development community on the importance of comprehensive development is the second element I would put out there.
Excellent, thank you very much. We are 5 minutes to closing, and I wish we were an hour away from closing, because there are so many rich issues, dimensions, and many questions still coming in. But what I will sadly have to do instead is to turn back to all of you and give everyone a chance to make any closing remarks, join any part of the conversation as has been raised. Maybe Francis, I can start with you in this round. Any remarks you would like to make about the issue we just discussed, OTI, authorities, civil society, please. And if you can do it in a minute, that'd be great.
Quickly, on civil society support, agree with George's points. I would just add that the Obama administration made a lot of efforts on improving civil society support. We then had 4 years of the Trump administration, which took a different approach. It would be a shame if we didn't harvest the lessons from the Obama administration, stand with civil society and elsewhere. There's a lot of goodness to be learned there, while recognizing the world has changed for civil society actors. They've been stepping up during COVID. There's also greater pretext for authoritarians to crack down on them. But we're not starting from a blank slate on civil society, so let's learn some of those lessons. Quickly on OTI and flexibility, this relates to civil society. We always hear this demand for greater flexibility in funding. I think we all agree that's important. The question is how. OTI has cracked that puzzle by a flexible procurement mechanism called grants under contract. It is not that it usually uses, it's notwithstanding authority. That's actually the minority of the cases. It's a procurement mechanism. And without getting into the non-glamorous details on that, I will just say that procurement mechanisms can be taken up by other parts of the US government. So there's learning, and maybe there already is some learning in other parts of the government. So I do think it's important to learn those lessons on flexible mechanisms. I will leave it there.
Wonderful, very important. And I love every time someone says, let's learn from what has worked and what has not worked. Very important advice to us. Patrick, your closing thoughts and comments you would like to make in a minute.
Yeah, sure. A couple of quick thoughts on the path forward for the GFA. I mean, two key problems stand out for me. One, that the US government truly embraces a whole of government approach. We've talked a lot today about the importance of foreign assistance, which is key, but conflict at its core, as we all agree, is a political problem. Therefore, there needs to be a really strong leadership role for the Department of State in using diplomacy to resolve these issues. And that links to my second and final point is we can have the most pristine implementation plans, but if the leadership and buy-in for the GFA is not at the highest levels, I don't see this going very far. Therefore, I think it would behoove the Biden administration to rescind the September of last year executive order to elevate back the leadership of the GFA to the White House, as well as name someone at the State Department, ideally at the undersecretary level, as the lead for this, getting away from the assistant secretary level. I'll leave it there. Thanks again, Vanda.
Great. George, please, your thoughts.
3 quick points on what's been said. Appreciate what Francis said on mining the experience of the Obama administration with civil society. To Vanda, you hit a really critical point on one of the problems is the need to spend money rapidly. We have to get away from that in fragile environments, and we need to start off spending money slowly with maybe a big incentive pot out there for when the politics and the capabilities are right. And back to Francis, your point on what do we do if we don't have, if the ambassador or USAID mission director don't agree with the approach, we change the personnel. We put the ambassador and an aid director in those countries that have the right experience, have the ability to analyze properly whether or not this fragile environment is right for our engagement or not. It always comes down to having the right people in the right place.
And there could not have been a better person in Libya, the best person for the place than Stephanie Williams. Stephanie, your concluding thoughts, please.
Well, thanks, Vanda. It was a whole, as you talk about a whole of government approach, it was a whole of mission approach in terms of what we accomplished in Libya. And I have to here also note the terrific work of the UN humanitarian agencies on the ground, particularly the World Health Organization, which has been operating in very difficult circumstances in Libya during the pandemic. Not, at the risk of not, repeating what has already been said, I'm very also supportive of the idea of knitting civil society closely into this tangled web in Libya of how to really move forward on DDR. We tried to do that in the fall of 2018 after that particular battle for Tripoli, and we were not entirely successful. But what I saw in the course, particularly of the political dialogue, was the really critical role that civil society can play, as well as women's organizations. Now, the other thing that so I do think Libya should be somehow woven into the GFA, should be a priority country, and it should be, I agree, elevated to the top of the hierarchy, the bureaucracy in Washington at the White House level. But we can't forget that in a country like Libya, which has now just yesterday marked the 10th anniversary of the uprising against Gaddafi, that processes, peace processes, need to be, undergirded, supported, almost put on the foundations of, an adherence to human rights principles, accountability, and transitional justice, which will ultimately lead to the national reconciliation, which Libyans now, I believe, are ready for, but we can't skip over, the need for this to all be rooted in those principles, because there is a horrible lack of accountability in Libya. And I believe that needs to be reflected in US foreign policy as well. I was pleased to see that the US government in the latter days of the Trump administration did sanction the Qaniyat militia, who have committed horrible crimes for many, many years in Tarhuna. And I hope that other countries take similar steps. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for just an absolutely terrific conversation. I learned so much. I am receiving many comments from our audience about how much they appreciated an absolutely stellar panel with terrific remarks by Ms. Stephanie Williams, Dr. George Ingram, Dr. Patrick Quirk, and Dr. Francis Brown. Throughout the whole hour and a half, I had been thinking about what the stabilization efforts and lessons, opportunities dealing with civil society, demanding accountability abroad mean for our own country, for the United States. where the issue of right-wing armed actors, right-wing militias or right-wing armed groups, in my view, poses far greater threat to democracy and rule of law in the country than any organized crime group, any Mexican cartel can, and arguably a foreign-based terrorist organization can. And so many of the dimensions, how do we DDR them? Do we designate them as terrorist groups? How do we engage with communities? How do we sever the links that many of these groups have cultivated with politicians, with sheriffs? How they permeate institutions such as US police departments or the military are now closer to home than at any time that we have seen in many decades. So that's something that I am intensely working on as part of the initiative of Nonstate Armed Actors, other colleagues at Brookings. And so I hope that maybe some months down the road, we can reconvene and think about the lessons from abroad for our own country. Till then, enormous thanks to all of you, enormous thanks to our audience for the rich questions, the many questions, and I look forward to another opportunity to engage.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.